Welcome to TrulyFit, the online fitness marketplace connecting pros and clients through unique fitness business software.
Ashley, thanks for joining the TrulyFit Podcast. It's great to have you here. Let's give the audience a background on you, professional bio of how it is you got into what you do and what it is that you do in fitness.
Well, I absolutely love teaching yoga and Pilates. I've done it for 14 years. I'm based out of Austin, Texas. I'm also the creator and host of Yoga and Podcast. It's a show about yoga and everything related to yoga. I got into Pilates when I was 19. I wanted a strong upper body. It gave me that. And then that led into teaching yoga. I found yoga because I had the most unregulated nervous system ever. And my acupuncturist was like, oh, you need some yoga. So I fell in love with yoga. And so that I teach specifically a really gentle, relaxing kind of yoga. And I do that with a harpist. And we do events around town. It's called Yoga and Harp. So that's what I'm known for in terms of my yoga. So yeah, that's a little bit about me and my professional background.
Well, we're going to jump right into it here. Now that we know that's what you do, you teach Pilates and yoga, you've been involved in it for years. We're going to have a bit more of a nuanced conversation about the differences between Pilates and yoga, if there are any, and why you should only do one or why you should do both. And we're going to kind of break that conversation down, and I'll certainly make sure that it's not easy for you. I'll poke at you a bit to make it a little bit more difficult. But let's start right away. And it could be your definition. It could be a textbook definition. It could just be descriptors. Describe to somebody who has no idea what these are, which isn't really this audience, but if we were just going to describe Pilates and yoga, how would you define them?
All right. So Pilates is about 200 years old. It was invented by a man named Joseph Pilates. It's based on vigorous, low impact movement. There's a lot of focus on the core. There's spring resistance, and then there's mat work, which is just body resistance. And it's what I consider a mind-body practice, but it's not a mind-body-spirit practice like yoga is. So yoga, on the other hand, was developed 5,000 years ago, based in northern India. And it's actually based off these ancient texts called the Vedas. And so there's a whole thing about philosophy in yoga. And actually, if you look at the physical practice of yoga, that's just one limb out of 8 limbs of yoga, right? So there is a bit of a more philosophical, spiritual element. There's mythology, there's code of conduct, there's metaphysical anatomy even. So they're both mind-body practices, but they're very, very different. In a nutshell, I guess, kind of an overview of how I see both yoga and Pilates.
That makes sense. So the commonalities are obviously like, they focus on breathing and core and postural alignment, and they're both low impact and balance, and they both have the mind body. But where you see the difference is they don't have necessarily the spiritual aspect, and maybe Pilates is just a little bit more focused again on the body component, and yoga delves into maybe a little bit more of a psychological and spiritual area.
Yeah, and I know we're going to go deeper into it, but there's also a rehabilitative element to Pilates that I'm sure we'll talk about later that I really want to discuss. So,
well, let's first break down the difference for those who don't know, let's say general personal trainers who don't use Pilates, the difference between mat Pilates, also known as floor Pilates, and then reformer Pilates. Can you describe that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm going to say mat Pilates and Pilates with the Pilates machines all having spring resistance. So the mat version is just your own body resistance. And you might have a prop or two in there that create a little bit of resistance, like a magic circle if you've seen one. It's a ring and you press into it and it creates resistance, or a TheraBand, big rubber band. so that you're just working with your own body in space, and you don't necessarily have a machine putting your body into place for you. Now you go over to the Pilates machines, you have blocks on the reformer, blocks holding your shoulders in place. You have straps in your hands or straps in your feet. You have feedback from the machine. And what's unique about Pilates machines, like no other machine, spring resistance. So it's I'm like, what do you think a spring is? A big giant spring, and there's resistance in both directions. So as you move the machine out, so you have a strap on your hand and it's attached to a spring. As you press into that strap, there's resistance. But as you slowly bring your hand back in, there's also resistance. So that's a very unique thing about the Pilates equipment, is that spring resistance.
And for those who only see or hear or imagine that spring resistance is about strength, it's quite the opposite. So when you lower the spring resistance, most of the exercises become more difficult because it's more of a control factor where your breathing and your core and all these things come into play. And just to add to that, also it's sort of counterintuitive a little bit. If you're a great teacher, you could probably teach all ages and all and different modifications in either of those realms. But if you're not a great teacher, I think it's actually easier to teach on the reformer if you have somebody who is older, who has injuries and things of that nature, because it's just a numbers game. The more toys you have to play with, the more options you have. When you're on the floor, you have less options, so there's not as many modifications. So it really is almost more difficult to be a really great floor instructor, in my opinion.
Yes. And going back to just being the experience I have of being a Pilates teacher, machines are fun, like everyone wants to get on that reformer. And in like, to your point, it is easier in a sense. Like you have a machine giving you feedback, so you know where you are in space, and then you get on the mat and it can feel less creative. You're not on a big toy anymore. Right. So yeah, there's people who love the machines, really love the machines, and they stick to the machines. I rarely see people like graduate from the machines and only do mat work, right? Because they love the machines. So.
And when I say easier, and I imagine you'll agree here, it's not easier insofar as the exercise, it's the person doing it. You can make the exercises on the machine as hard as any exercise you could ever do in your life. I just mean for the instructor, you have way more options, right? So as an instructor
exactly.
On the ground, on the floor, if you're only using a Pilates ring and a TheraBand in someone's body and their body has issues, you're going to be very limited. And on a machine,
exactly.
Yes. If you're creative, you have literally endless exercises you can do.
That's to your point. Yes, I totally agree with that.
So let's go into what Pilates maybe provides from a physical aspect that yoga doesn't, if anything at all.
Pilates, what's unique about Pilates, and there's sometimes this misconception that Pilates is only core. It's not that it's not only core, it's specific cueing on how to engage your core, and really almost this minutia of details and pelvic alignment, and it's almost like rehabilitative in that way. There's a lot of like, it's kind of physical therapist-esque Pilates, and so you get a lot of details on exactly how to engage your core that I feel like yoga doesn't really touch on, or it's not really the emphasis of yoga necessarily. You get someone staring you down, looking at your alignment and telling you to shift your body, usually in a group Pilates class, in a private Pilates class. So there's a lot of attention on you and your alignment in Pilates. And I think that actually, I think that's really helpful for people. They really show up, and they also want to notice their alignment. If someone's staring you down, looking at your alignment, you want to also make sure you're aligned, right? You don't want to be that one that's just completely off in the class. So there's a little bit of that in Pilates, which I think is really unique and interesting. Now, yoga also has alignment-based class. Yoga also has alignment-based practices as well, where there is a focus on alignment, but I think not to the level that Pilates is.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think, adding to that or just piggybacking off of that, in yoga, most of the time, a good instructor or any instructor really does the class with you. They kind of have to, right? They have to show the movements. You can verbally talk about the movements, but really people are visual in that sense, and you don't know if it's someone's first class or not. So you're going to go through the movements. In a lot of the Pilates-based teachings, you can go in the movement quickly and then get out of it as the instructor and start walking around and correcting people, I think, in my opinion, a little bit easier than yoga. So like you said, even if you're not doing it one-on-one, even if you're in a class, you're much more likely to really be picky about all the different forms and all the things going on, where in a yoga class, sometimes that's just too difficult as a yoga teacher to do.
You know what? And it's so funny because as somebody who teaches both yoga and Pilates, like as a full-time profession, you're right. I never really thought about it that much, but as a Pilates teacher, I'm rarely demoing or I'm demoing, but I'm rarely doing the exercise with people. But in yoga, I do full sequences with my students. So yeah, and I'm like, oh yeah, I don't sweat as much when I teach Pilates, but I do sweat when I teach yoga.
Is there something that yoga provides outside of the spiritual aspect, which you already talked about, that Pilates doesn't, whether it's a purely a strength-based thing, if it's like, oh, well, you work a little bit more legs there, or we have the ability to go faster or use heat in the practice, whatever that is there something that you think is important to point out that yoga has that Pilates might not have?
So what's so interesting, I was a horrible yoga student, by the way, when I first started yoga, but I was a pretty established Pilates teacher who had been doing Pilates for years and years. And why I initially sucked at yoga was I didn't do standing postures ever. I didn't hold still in a warrior one or warrior two. My body wasn't used to that. And tree pose, balancing on one leg, there's not a whole lot of balancing poses, standing poses or balancing poses in Pilates. There's a bunch in yoga, and there's a bunch of, it's interesting. They call it poses in yoga, and then they call it exercises in Pilates. In yoga, you are really holding a pose. You're staying put, breathing for a few breaths, and then you move on to the next pose. And so there's this beautiful fluid kind of sequence that you develop specifically like in a Vinyasa practice or a yoga flow practice that is kind of like a dance but it's a skill. It's a skill. I think it's something that you have to learn. Arm balances is another thing in yoga that Pilates does not have. And then the other thing I want to say is I get a little bit more of a nurturing vibe from yoga. We're taking time to pause and center before we even move. And then we move and we apply healthy stress to our body, healthy postures, or healthy stress or the postures. And then at the end, you always rest in Shavasana. It is a pose, pose about surrender. And so you start with a regulated nervous system, you get a challenged nervous system, and then you end with a regulated nervous system. And I think that's what's unique about yoga is the narrative arc of the nervous system. So I think that's a little different than Pilates. Yeah.
And those are all great points. And again, just to add to that, I think, again, this might also go into that spiritual aspect, which I said not to comment on, but I will anyway. Yeah. And in yoga, you can zen out a bit more than you can in Pilates. If in classical Pilates, which I don't really teach, I teach sort of a modified Pilates, but in a classical Pilates, the instructors don't shut up. So they're cueing you every 2 seconds, right? Ribs imprinted, point your toes, circle this way, inhale this way, big exhale through, come on up, feet up this way. So they don't stop talking. So you can't zen out, right? You have to stay attentive. And from a mind-body perspective, you can sort of get into your body. You can close your eyes and try to feel the movements that the instructor talks about, but you can't totally zone out because you have to take in all those things. Where in yoga, I've been in some yoga classes before, and we'll talk about this next, the different types of yoga, where, there's 1 to 2, maybe even 3 minutes where there's no talking, and I can just kind of hold a movement or sort of get into a movement. And I think that's a big difference for people who don't otherwise know that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think what I like about the Pilates cueing, where like you're saying nonstop, you are in your mind because you have to process what they're saying. But I think what's so cool about it is you're very, very, very present because you're actively listening the whole time. And I think actively listening is a skill that you develop. I think there's a lot of people where they don't listen. So I think it's really cool. I think it's a really cool thing. Like it's presence in a different way. Whereas in yoga, there'll be silence. And in a way, you're being really present with yourself. So I just like those two different approaches to being present.
Yeah, and I think, for those again who don't practice either of these two things, or especially not Pilates, reformer Pilates, although there's typically mirrors maybe in the room that the instructor can see. If you're lying on your back, or if you're prone or supine, you can't necessarily see yourself. So although you're hearing these directions, it's not like you're in a weight room and you can see yourself doing them. You have to keep adjusting to what the instructor is saying, right? You might think your feet are at a certain angle. They're not, right? The instructor's telling you to continue to move down. So you do have that, again, mind-body connection, much like you do in yoga. It's just sometimes not as, again, not as silent. You're a little bit more, like you said, active listening is a great term for that.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go right to what I talked about before. I quickly mentioned it. There's different types of yoga classes. Now in Pilates, of course, there's different types, and there's in the industry, it's now become a fad to actually change up the reformer. There's something called like an X-former, and they're making like HIIT classes on the reformers.
Oh, what? I didn't. Well, I heard about Legree. I haven't heard about this X-former though.
There's been a few of them. There's a guy named Kai Evans who's down in Miami, and he started this whole big thing. And I think some funding or something fell through, but he's starting it back up. And he's got basically a reformer, not like a Cadillac. There's no like bars going up it, but he's turned it into a really fun HIIT class. And there's music going on, and he's using, mostly traditional movements, but he just uses them in different ways with the music, and it's exciting. But for the most part, Pilates, there's not that many different kinds of Pilates, where in yoga, it seems like there's so many practices that, you almost have to be wary. Like, I don't want to join a yoga class unless I know what practice I'm going into. One time, I'll tell a quick story here, a quick anecdote. I was in Vietnam on my honeymoon, actually, and I was under the impression that Bikram yoga was just hot yoga, meaning it was just the yoga classes that I take in America and heated, right? So they asked me, have you done Bikram yoga? I was like, yeah, I've done Bikram yoga before. Well, no, I haven't, right? So Bikram yoga was a certain type of yoga where there's set amount of movements, and they do those movements in set order. And it was exponentially harder than I thought. And that's, I don't think I'm the only one that's in that space. I'm in personal training. I'm in the fitness world, and I don't even understand all the nuances to the different yogas. Can you just describe a few of them for us, the ones you teach, and maybe some like subtle differences between the ones you teach?
Yeah, and I can do that. And then there's like a couple that I don't teach that I think like there's three that are unique, and it might like clarify as well. So yin yoga, which I touched on earlier, and it's a gentle, deep practice of yoga where you hold postures for minutes at a time, and you're low to the ground, and it's passive. And the reason why you practice this style of yoga is it tractions and lengthens the connective tissues of the body, the less elastic tissues of the body, the connective tissue, the tendons, and it's really meditative in nature. So that's one style of yoga, yin yoga. Another style is the classic Hatha Yoga, the one that is kind of iconic. Like you see the people sitting in a cross-legged seat with their hand mudras, making the okay signs. And like, that's the quintessential kind of like the classic Hatha Yoga. Hatha is Sanskrit for I believe it's Sanskrit for sun and moon, or joining together the sun and moon. Hatha, I'm pretty sure.
Well, luckily for you, I don't read Sanskrit, so I can't call you out on it.
Okay. Oh, okay. Perfect. And so it's the sun and moon, meaning the yin and the yang, right? So gentle stretches, and then every now and then some vigorous movement, but not quick movement. Now, moving from Hatha Yoga to quicker movement would be something called Vinyasa. And so Vinyasa class would be, you would flow from, if you happen to know the names, down dog to plank to chaturanga to up dog. That is your typical vinyasa. It's like you're lowering down to your belly, then you do a little back bend, then you come into down dog, like an upside down V, okay? That would be a vinyasa. And you do that throughout class. You do some yoga postures, then you do a vinyasa sequence, then you do some yoga postures, then you do a vinyasa sequence. This is the type of yoga where you start to sweat. Okay, so beyond that, there's other types of yoga. There's something called Ashtanga Yoga, which is heated, not heated like Bikram. Bikram's like 200 degrees heated. Ashtanga is just like slightly heated, I think like 90 to 100 degrees. And it's also a set sequence. It is a set sequence where new Ashtanga students bring a little piece of it's like a book of the order. And it's very hands-on. Now, I don't know if it's hands-on right now due to the current times, but your Ashtanga teacher will take your arm and kind of pull it behind your back for you. Maybe they even sit on your body. I mean, you know, obviously when you're ready and in a respectful way, but it's pretty hardcore. This one, you sweat even more. It's usually 90 minutes. And then Kundalini Yoga is called the kind of yoga that gets you high. It's the yoga of light. Russell Brand loves Kundalini Yoga, if you know Russell Brand.
Sure.
And it's more energetic. You're seated, you're doing a lot of chants, a lot of mantras, so a lot of Sanskrit repetitive chants. And the idea is there's a Kundalini snake within your body and you're kind of waking it up. More or less. I don't teach it, but I take. Oh, Iyengar. Iyengar is the last one I just want to mention because I think it's really interesting. It's actually really rare in Austin. We don't have a whole lot of Iyengar yoga studios, but it's the type of yoga with lots and lots of props. And if you know what a yoga wall is, it's a wall where there are yoga straps attached to it. Very much influenced by Iyengar. And it is the alignment-based yoga. It's like the OG of alignment. So that's just some ideas on, and I like to say different types of yoga lineages. There's like different music genres. If you don't, you like eventually. So, yeah.
Well, I think you at least named 6, if not 7 or 8. And I know there's 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 more. It's unbelievable how many different yogas there are. And I can't keep up. I do Vinyasa, not often enough, but that's really all I do. And I think it seems to be, you can correct me if I'm wrong, probably the most common, the most popular, because you're getting people who are, relatively, I'll call them the general population of fitness, who maybe take to that a little bit more, because you don't necessarily need as much as the spiritual in that. It can just be a workout. You can take components of it. So, personal trainers will use yoga for a warm up, essentially, right? We'll go down dog, up dog. We'll come into warrior 1, warrior 2, go through that 3 or 4 times. And that's essentially our warm up. As some of the other practices obviously involve the spiritual right from the outset, and it seems more tied to it. But I also want to mention, for a lot of people, starting a mat Pilates class or a floor Pilates, either one you want to call it, or starting a yoga class is much different than working on a reformer because of price too. And that's a price point issue. And your reformers can cost up to $8,000, maybe even more than that now. Yeah. You can certainly get them on secondhand markets for $2,000 and $3,000 and $4,000, but they're very expensive. So when you're going to reformer classes and working with someone, that is also going to be more expensive. You're not only paying top dollar because of the equipment, but because you're typically working in a one-on-one fashion. There are classes, but they're not going to be as big, right? You're not going to walk into a lot of reformer classes that have 30 people. In yoga, that's more of the norm. Tips that you want to pass on to those who are teaching yoga and Pilates in group settings in particular, things that you've learned over the years that maybe you wish you would have done differently?
I think connect to whatever it is you love about that type of work the most. So if, be it Pilates or yoga, what is it specifically that you love about Pilates? What I loved about Pilates, I loved the hands and feet, like working with the hands and feet. And so I do hands and feet workshops around town, and it's really, it's really whole body, but there's a lot of minutia that's around the hands and feet. And that's my specialty. Whatever it is that you gravitate to and you love and you keep going back for it, that, like, focus on that, because in this profession, as you know, you need a niche. You need to be unique. And whatever it is about that exercise that lights you up is contagious. And when you teach that thing that you love in yoga or Pilates, people feel that, and you're going to attract the right people. You're going to attract your dream clients. When you just teach just to teach and you don't know why you're teaching, you lose sight of why you've taught in the first place. And I've been there, and you don't attract the right people. And so you have to stop and decide, okay, why do I love doing this? Why have I chosen to teach this? And then get back to what it is that you love.
Yeah, that's fantastic information. You need to start out as a generalist so that you can get access to more people, and that's so you understand all of the areas. But eventually you need to niche down and get those clientele, not only from a love standpoint, which is important, because the more you gravitate towards it, the more time you're going to spend researching it, the more people around you are going to notice, again, your energy towards that. And that's all great too. But also from a business perspective, from a financial perspective, if you have that expertise, you can now charge more in that area. So you might have a yoga class where you're teaching 40 people. It's a generalist yoga class. You're charging $12 a head, but then you're an expert in headstands, and all those people who love to do headstands, you go, well, guess what? I have a separate class. I only take 8 people, but I charge $25 a head. So, that's just part of the business and all of fitness. And we're not ripping people off. It's, if you're a specialist and you're dedicated and you do have these extra tips, it's helping everybody. So
yeah, and it's an energy exchange. You're spending all this time and energy perfecting this specialty. You are providing value, so the energy exchange is they're going to give you.
Yeah, and you can't fake it. I mean, you can for your first class, but word of mouth is always our best marketing tool. So if enough classes go wrong, it's not going to work. So I will also just add a caveat to that. You don't need to niche immediately. If you're teaching if you're teaching your first yoga class, you're a few years away from being able to do that. So take time, find out what you love, and then go about that. Now, what about tips for teaching in private, whether you're doing like a one-on-one with someone in yoga or Pilates? Do you have any advice to give a young trainer?
Teach as much as you possibly can. It's hard. It's hard. There's awkward moments, but the more you flex that muscle, the better teacher you'll become. And you just have to go through it. Read a room. And it's something you have to just constantly hone in. If you're intuitive at all, that's going to be a huge, huge plus working one-on-one with somebody. If you're not intuitive at all, maybe that's not your strong suit. But intuition is a good skill to have or develop if you're working one-on-one, because you have to kind of figure out why they're there, how you can retain them, not in a manipulative way, just in a way that is like, why are they truly here? They might say they want one thing, but really you can tell they keep coming back because they really like this one stretch and they're not alluding to it, right? There's all kinds of reasons people come one-on-one, and they may not be as, direct. And so like deeply listening to what they're wanting and using your intuition is a way to retain. So that's my little tidbit.
I think that's great advice, and you have to be a good listener. And like you said, it's not for everybody. And maybe you being the listener are just going to be a group fitness instructor, and you don't have the skill set or the yearning to work one-on-one, because it does, you give a lot more of yourself when you're one-on-one. It is a relationship of sorts. You have to read people. If you work 6 or 7 hours one-on-one with people, it's more exhausting than maybe even teaching 6 or 7 classes, maybe not from a physical perspective, but certainly psychologically, because, you know, you've had to play that social chameleon role for all of those hours. Whereas in a class, you know, you keep up or you get out, and essentially, right? I'm doing my own thing. Of course, I'm going to modify and tweak things, but there's a reason you're paying less. It's because, you know, I'm providing a sort of a generalized experience in a class. Let's talk about your podcast a little bit more. What is an episode like in your podcast? Are they all different? How do you go about picking your podcast episodes?
Yeah. So my podcast is called Yoga and Podcast, and it's about the magic of yoga and mind-body practices, taking that down to earth for the everyday real person. So it's called Yoga and, because every week is a different topic related to yoga. So episodes will be like yoga and Buddhism, yoga and climbing, yoga and the helping profession. And so the idea is we relate. I mean, I do have an episode on yoga and stand-up comedy, because I used to be a stand-up comedian, and how that's helped me learn how to teach a class, you know, like just from those skills. So we take sometimes likely and unlikely subjects, and we put them against yoga, and like, how is this related? So like goat yoga is really big now. So I want to do an episode on yoga and goats and just talk about it, you know?
Yeah.
So that's the podcast. It's fun. It's for people who don't know anything about yoga, and it's for people who absolutely love yoga.
That's an awesome concept. And that was the first thing that came to mind. Whether you're like a yoga nut or you know nothing about yoga, you have at least 50% of the podcast that has nothing necessarily to do with yoga, and you're just comparing it to yoga. So it seems like that really, you know, broadens the audience a bit. And that's a really great idea.
Yeah, thank you. And I've learned so much. Like, I mean, I had no idea interviewing people, how much I'd learn. And it's been like the best continuing education, not only in my teaching, but obviously, as you know, like the skill set of podcasting is its own set of education, but I love it. And it's on all major platforms.
On all major platforms. I will link to it and post it in all the descriptions. Ashley, thanks so much for joining the TrulyFit Podcast, and I hope to speak down the road on another yoga-related topic.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. You're such a good listener, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you.